Every few weeks, somebody asks me the same question wearing a different outfit. Should I put my whole fleet on one proxy provider or spread it across 3 or 4 different ones? And almost every time, they're not asking out of curiosity. Something already broke. A provider had a rough week, a whole IP range got flagged, and 40 accounts died in a single afternoon, all at once, all on the same day. That is not bad luck. That is exactly what happens when your entire operation sits behind one set of subnets, and something about that provider gets noticed by a platform. I run proxy infrastructure and cloud phones out of Singapore for real account fleets. So this question is not theoretical for me, it is Tuesday. I have had this go wrong in both directions. I have been too concentrated on one provider and watched a big chunk of accounts go down together. I have also been too scattered across providers with no system and watched accounts get flagged for looking inconsistent instead of looking suspicious. Neither extreme is free. The honest answer is that diversify your proxies is correct advice that gets applied badly a lot more often than it gets applied well. So let's talk about how detection actually works underneath all of this, because it changes how you should think about the whole question. Platforms do not ban IP addresses one at a time based on some single bad signal from one account. They build reputation around ranges. An SN, which is just the network block that an ISP or a provider owns, develops a history over time. How many accounts have logged in from that block? What device fingerprints kept showing up next to it? Whether the traffic pattern looks like a real household or looks like a data center renting out static IP addresses dressed up as residential. Residential and mobile proxies work in the first place because they route through real internet provider infrastructure. So the IP address itself looks legitimate to a platform doing a quick check. But the platform is not just scoring that IP in isolation, it is scoring the whole combination. This subnet, this carrier, this device fingerprint, this login speed, this account creation pattern, all stacked together. When a proxy provider sells the same pool of exit IP addresses to hundreds of customers, and a good chunk of those customers are running similar automation or similar account behavior, the platform starts associating that subnet with the behavior itself, not just with any one customer running it. That is how a provider-wide flag actually happens. You did not do anything unusual with your own accounts. Somebody else sharing your IP pool did something unusual, and the reputation damage from that gets shared across everyone on the pool. This is the real mechanism behind the story of a whole fleet going down at once. It is subnet level correlation, not some magic detection tool that figured out your specific setup. So there is a real case for consolidating onto one provider, and I do not want to pretend there is not. A single provider you know well means consistent session behavior. You understand their sticky session windows, how their mobile carrier rotation actually works, whether their residential pool is genuinely sourced from real peer-to-peer connections, or whether it is repackaged data center traffic wearing a residential label. Consistency matters here, because your antidetect browser fingerprints need to match the network layer underneath them. If your proxy says Jakarta mobile carrier, but your time zones, your language headers, and your battery applicator say something else entirely, that mismatch is its own detection problem, completely separate from IP reputation. One provider you have actually tested and understand reduces the chances of that kind of internal inconsistency creeping into your setup without you noticing. Billing is simpler too, account management is simpler, and honestly the support relationship matters more than people give it credit for. When you are running cloud phones at scale, having one point of contact who will actually tell you which subnets got burnt last week, instead of leaving you to find out the hard way, saves you real time and saves you accounts. Now the flip side. If you put everything on one provider, you have made your entire fleet dependent on one company's IP pool health, and you have zero visibility into who else is sharing that same pool with you. If that provider gets a large chunk of their subnets flagged, whether that is because of their own infrastructure choices or because of what some other customer did on the same pool, you do not get a partial hit, you get a fleet-wide event. Every account you are running through that provider inherits the same reputation problem on the same day, at the same time, with no warning. There is also a plain operational risk here that has nothing to do with detection at all. Outages happen, rate limits change without much notice. A provider decides to deprioritize a region you depend on. A pricing change lands and your unit economics stop working overnight. When that provider is your only supplier, you have no fallback while you are renegotiating or scrambling to migrate. You are stuck waiting on one company's timeline while your fleet sits there exposed. So what does splitting across several smaller providers actually get you? It means a subnet level flag against one of them does not take out your whole fleet in one shot. If provider A's mobile pool in a given region gets burned, only the accounts routed through provider A take the hit. The rest of your fleet keeps running while you investigate and rotate that segment out quietly. I want to be clear that this is containment, not prevention. It does not make any individual account safer on its own. It limits how far the damage spreads when something eventually goes wrong, and something eventually does. Diversification also hands you comparative data that you cannot get any other way. Running the same account type on two different providers over the same stretch of time tells you which one actually holds up, instead of you guessing based on whatever the provider's own marketing page claims. That is the only way I would ever call a provider's residential pools solid, because I have watched real account survival on it over months, not because of a claim printed on their website. Here is the part people skip past too fast though. Scattering across too many providers with no system behind it is its own failure mode, and it can be just as damaging as putting everything on one provider. If you are mixing pools without matching them carefully to the right accounts, you can end up with an account that logged in last month from a residential IP in one city, and this month from a mobile carrier IP 3 time zones away, with no travel history and no plausible reason for that jump. That is a worse signal than staying on one mediocre provider consistently, because inconsistent geography and inconsistent session behavior are detection vectors all on their own. There is also a management cost that is easy to underestimate when you are juggling several providers. Every provider has its own session length behavior, its own rotation logic, its own way of handling sticky IP addresses over a session. If your antidetect browser profiles are not configured per provider to account for those differences, you introduce fingerprint mismatches that have nothing to do with proxy quality and everything to do with sloppy setup on your end. More providers means more configurations to keep straight, and every single one you add is another thing that can quietly drift out of sync with your profiles without you noticing. So the useful version of diversification is not buy from 5 vendors and mix everything randomly. It is deciding which accounts sit on which pool and then keeping that mapping stable over time, instead of shuffling it around. A cluster of accounts tied to one platform and one warm-up cohort stays on one provider's pool for the whole life of that cluster. A different cluster, ideally running a different browser fingerprint profile and a different warm-up schedule, sits on a second provider entirely. If one cluster takes a hit, the damage is contained to that cluster, and you get to compare how the two providers actually perform side by side instead of guessing. This is also where cloud phones matter, and they are a separate lever from residential proxies entirely. A cloud phone gives you a real mobile device fingerprint and carrier-grade network behavior bundled together in one package, which is a genuinely different risk profile than a residential proxy paired with a spoofed browser fingerprint sitting on top of it. Mixing both approaches across your fleet, instead of betting everything on just one method, is its own form of diversification, and it has nothing to do with how many proxy vendors you happen to be paying invoices to each month. So here is the practical way I tell people to think about this whole question. It is not one provider or many providers. It is how much of my fleet am I comfortable seeing exposed if this specific pool has a bad week. If that number makes you uncomfortable when you actually say it out loud, the pool is too concentrated, whether that is one provider or 5 providers that are all quietly routed through the same underlying carrier agreements, which happens more often than people realize. Ask providers directly where their IP pools actually originate from. Some of them resell the exact same upstream carrier deals under different brand names, which means you can think you have diversified, tell yourself you have spread the risk around, and actually be sitting on the exact same underlying pool the whole time without knowing it. Here is what that actually looks like when you ask. I've had providers answer straight, naming the actual mobile carrier or the actual backbone their residential nodes ride on. I've also had providers get vague fast, talk in circles about proprietary sourcing, and never actually name a carrier. That vagueness is the answer. If they won't tell you where the IP pool originates, assume you don't actually know how diversified you are, no matter how many separate invoices you're paying. None of this guarantees your accounts survive, and I am not going to pretend it does. It does not make any provider safe in some absolute sense, and I would never claim that about a pool without having watched it hold up over real time myself, month after month. What diversification actually does, done well, is limit how much of your fleet goes down together when something inevitably goes wrong. That is the whole point of thinking in terms of blast radius instead of thinking in terms of good provider versus bad provider. In practice, here's roughly how I structure things on my own fleet. I pick 2 or 3 providers whose pools I have actually tested over real time, not just skimmed on a sales page. I map specific account clusters to specific providers, and I write that mapping down somewhere. Because relying on memory across a large fleet is how mistakes creep in. I keep browser fingerprint profiles matched to whichever provider that cluster is sitting on. So the carrier, the time zones, the language headers, and the device profile all agree with each other. And I check in on each pool's health regularly instead of assuming yesterday's good provider is still today's good provider. Because pools drift, ownership changes, and reputation can shift underneath you without any announcement at all. I run these farms myself, so when I point you at the proxies or cloud phones I actually use, you're seeing the real stack, not an affiliate guest dressed up as advice. Full written guides and tested picks are at multiaccountops.com, and if this kind of breakdown was useful, go ahead and subscribe.